All right, we'll spend just a little bit of time on this because one of the things that some students struggle with is interpreting video reference. Like, what do I look for? And I'll start with, where did my animation go? There it is, for my video reference. Usually, one of the things for me, I do everything pretty much pose-based. I'm a pose-based animator, so I look for key poses. So when studying animation, like Mr. Bean coming out here doing this crazy dance, I'll look for what are the main poses. When I scrub through the video reference, okay, I'll look for the extremes of action. So the first thing I'll look for is kind of the extremes of the hips, right? So he's got an extreme here. Here's kind of one pose right through there. Here's kind of another pose. Here's another pose as he's coming down because his feet are coming together. So I can also look at the context of the feet when they move and when they stop. So finding out those moments, in a walk cycle it's a little easier because if we're looking at this walk cycle, for instance, and I'll look at it from the side view. Do I have a side view of this? Zoom out. It's a little easier to break the action down because we know the extremes are on the, I'll look for just him walking. So boom, extreme number one right here. This is a pose, right? So what I do is when I'm observing my video reference, I'm looking for line of action. I'm looking for the angle of the foot, how far forward that foot is, what's the distance between the 2 feet. These are kind of observations I'm making that are relevant to when I pose this in Maya. What's the twist of the hips? It's a little easier to see in the side view than it is the back view. How much his hip is twisting and which way it's twisting. The shoulders are twisting in the opposite direction, right? When you're doing a walk cycle. What are his arms doing at the extreme? What's the angle of this bent elbow? What's the angle of this bent elbow? And then the angle of the wrist. So not just from the side view, but also the front view, because that arm is crossing in front of him. It's crossing in front of his belly, right? So I've got to determine, I'm like looking at that angle, it's hard to see here, but from the front view, I can get a better idea of that position. What's the angle of the neck? What's the tilt of the head? Okay, all these things are things that I'm observing. When I find that iconic extreme pose, then I can make observations based off of that. And those observations can then get translated into my CG puppet, right? So I typically, you could either make notes, you could do drawovers on top of your video to help out. A lot of people nowadays, they put their video reference in Maya, which is pretty easy to do. And I think Tony might even have a how-to video on doing that in one of the sections of the website. So it's pretty easy to do. But that can help you as well because you have that right there in your Maya file and you can observe it and do that kind of thing. So once I have that extreme pose, then I go to the other extreme pose, right? And look at it from this point of view and make some observations here. Then in terms of, okay, what's the breakdown pose? What's the passing pose look like in the walk cycle? Again, what's the overall line of action? Right now he's pretty much straight up, but there is a slight bend to his body. Where's the foot in the passing pose, the tip of the foot in relation to the heel of this foot? So all those things I'm making observations on. So I think it helps to break things down at that level. The first thing I look for is the line of action. What's the line of action of the character? And in the case of Mr. Bean, so when we find a good extreme pose on Mr. Bean, like here, in this pose here, he's at the height of his little dance. What's the overall line of action is this S curve. through the body. Now, from that S-curve, I can deduce some things about the hips and the shoulders, right? From this line of action, I can deduce that his shoulders, because there's this curve through here, there's going to be some contrapposto going on, which is the way the hips and the shoulders tend to rotate opposite each other. So kind of works like this, right? Your hips pointing up, the shoulders, shoulders going to counter, right? Contrapposto, I think, literally means counterpose. So if you can find out what's happening in the hips, you can almost always extract from that. It may be difficult to see in your video reference, but you can pretty much guarantee what the shoulders are doing, or what the torso is doing, rather. It's doing the opposite of what the hips are. And that is deduced from the line of action, right? So if I got this curve through the spine, I can find out what the hips are doing. I can find out what the shoulders are doing. So there's many different ways to observe video reference and find out what's going on. These things are key to posing your character. It's like determining, what the angle of this is, determining what the angle of that is, because that's direct to what you're doing with your character. You're rotating these controls a certain amount based off of your video reference. You can look at just the spine. If you have trouble like figuring out what the spine is doing, you can see that when he's going up his hips, there's this nice curvature here, but when he drops down to this pose here, we're getting this opposite reversal in the spine. So his spine is doing this kind of reversal on certain extremes, right? And you may even observe that a little bit on your walk. You may observe some slight kind of rotation of the spine and the hips, the way his body is as he's moving forward. The slight change in the slight reversal in the spine going on. If you want to get super analytical about it, you can even go so far as to say, okay, well, here's the low point of the character, and I'm going to use kind of the belt buckle as the mark for that. Here's the high point. The low point was there. Here's the high point. That's about a character's head distance in height, based on his proportions. So you go in there and you're like, okay, well, that distance in Maya is probably about that much, making those kinds of observations, the amount of distance traveled.